Okay, so finally we get to our graph. And see here on our graph, we have the world GDP as measured in Troy, in gold Troy ounces, in blue here. So this is commodity capital. All right, this is what most people would think of as the real production of the economy. This is basically my measure of real GDP, which I think is a much more honest measure of real GDP than even the so-called real GDP measures that mainstream economists get when they adjust for inflation using a consumer price index. Here we've adjusted for inflation by comparing the dollar's depreciation versus gold. All right, so this is world GDP. You see some huge boom times and then some huge downswings. So late 60s, 1960s was definitely a boom time, you can see. Even into the kind of the early 1970s. Capitalism was apparently doing great. Actual commodity production was surging ahead. All right. There you see in the 70s, stagflation crisis and that recession. And if you look at a chart of GDP in the 70s, if it's measured in fiat dollars or even in real adjusted for inflation fiat dollars, you don't see this depression uh, displayed so starkly. But here, gold's showing you, gold does not lie in this case. It shows there was a horrible depression in the 70s in real GDP. Then you have the recovery of the 80s and then the boom of the 90s. All right. And then here, according to gold, GDP, gold's measurement of GDP, world GDP actually peaked about the year 2000 or so. And then ever since then, we've been sliding into, what was at first a recession, now really a really bad, depression in world commodity capital production. Although things have started to actually recover since about 2010 or so. All right. Here we see world gold production. And this is in troy ounces, basically multiplied by 1,000 so that we could put it on the same scale. Because interestingly, on average, the world's production of actual gold material is about 1,000th of uh, the production of commodities measured in gold, troy ounces. So what does that tell you? That tells you that there's quite a bit of credit in the system, even during depression times, that a lot of things are being bought and sold on credit instead of being exchanged for actual cold hard cash. As Marx put it, there are a lot of ingenious ways where capitalism can somewhat, to certain limits, economize on the amount of actual money material that it needs to circulate commodities. But there is a limit to this. All right, you can't inflate credit so much at a certain point. Uh, as money becomes more scarce, the rate of interest increases and eats up all of the profit of enterprise. And then industrial capitalists, if they can't take home any of the profit rate, if all of it goes to the money capitalists, then there's no incentive to actually engage in production, and production drops off. All right, so you see here. So let's look at the trends here. One thing that jumps out to me is you see here this boom time of the late 60s, early 70s. All right, here you can see this is a time when money capital was becoming increasingly scarce, when commodity capital and its production was outrunning the production of money capital. So increasingly, capitalists were producing more and more commodities that could not actually be bought with money capital. In other words, the production was outpacing the expansion of the market, because the expansion of the market is basically the expansion of money capital, of commodity money to purchase all of this commodity capital at its value. And so, as is often the case, capitalism shows, especially with the use of credit, shows an ability to physically expand production of commodities far above the ability, far outpacing the ability of the market to absorb those commodities. So commodity capital was outrunning the money capital needed to purchase these commodities. And increasingly what you saw in the late 60s, early 70s, as evidence of this, was increasing interest rates. All right, as money capital here, which is being underproduced, became more and more scarce, the rate of interest, the price of borrowing this money capital basically, or its representatives in token money, in terms of fiat dollar money that ultimately represented the commodity money gold, this interest rate, this price of borrowing this money increased. And that brought this expansion to a screeching halt. And by the way, in terms of interest rates, we should really be talking in terms of real interest rates. Nominal interest rates were increasing even more because of inflation. But even real interest rates started to increase at a certain point and eat into the profit of enterprise. I mean, nominal interest rates were up to like 20% by the late 1970s. It was absurd. And real interest rates probably pretty high, probably about 5 to 10% at various points. So, which is probably not much less than the actual rate of profit in a lot of industries. So those industries had to shut down. All of their profits were going towards paying interest, or even more so, and then some in some cases. So they couldn't. There was no profit motive to stay in production if there was no profit of enterprise. So there you get the late 70s and the horrible, depression that you get from, especially the Volcker shock, which was necessary to stop the inflation and to update the signal, basically, that money commodity was scarce. In actual, gold was scarce, to give the world a signal that more money commodity needed to be produced. All right. And so the inflation of the token money supply had to be stopped, which would then stop inflation. But this increase in interest rates gave people the incentive to invest in money commodity production. You see the production of gold increasing during the 80s and during the 90s. And in a lagging way, this also expanded the market for commodity production. So commodity production was in a depression, but it started to recover by mid to late 1980s in the world. And once again, though, commodity production started to outstrip the market to purchase these commodities. So that by the late 90s, we're in another unsustainable boom. And at this point, interest rates sort of started to increase, although arguably not enough to really send the correct signals that, hey, we need more money commodity produced. All right. By all rights, interest rates should have increased a lot more in the late 90s. That would have sent the signal that, hey, we're short on money commodity. We need more money material, more gold produced to catch up to this increase in commodity capital, so that we can circulate all of this commodity capital. But that did not happen due to credit kind of artificially decreasing the appearance of the need for real money, because people think, oh, we can just use credit money. We don't need this real money production. We can use credit. Due to the credit bubble, once again, this commodity capital continued to outstrip money capital production until we get, especially here about 2007, plunges down even farther. But now look where we are here. We're here at basically the depression, and we see that money capital is actually not scarce at all at this point relative to commodity capital. It's actually commodity capital that's scarce. All right. And we see this reflected in current interest rates. Interest rates are very low. All right. So industrial capitalists are getting to take home the lion's share of the profit rate.